Okay, so what I want to talk about today, because I think it's going to be a little bit relevant to some topics that are going around recently, is I want to talk about how to evaluate character strength and more specifically the different ways that you can make and look at tier lists in fighting games. So to help us out with this, we're going to be bringing out our good friend, Tier List Maker. This is my greatest asset as a content creator, is Tier List Maker. We're not going to be really making a tier list today, but I'm going to be using Tier List Maker as a way to show examples of the different types of tiers that you'll see in fighting games. Because there's different schools of thought that you can have when you're making like a tier list or just talking about character strength in fighting games. And I think this is coming up a lot right now in the Guilty Gear scene because there's a lot of talk about North America compared to Japan and all the other regions. I literally did a video already talking about that topic specifically. If you'd like to go watch that already, I'll link that in the description. But today I want to talk about specifically the idea of the different types of tier lists that people can make and the different types of schools of thought that people have when they're making fighting game tier lists. So I'm going to make a couple of like mock tier lists, I guess, that we can look at for the different types of thought processes you can have. So first off, the most common way that I think people tend to look at tier lists, and I should actually preface this by saying that a lot of tier lists are usually a combination of the different schools of thought and not just specifically one way of thinking, at least usually. But the most common thing that people consider when they're making a tier list and evaluating characters is the theoretical / on paper strength of characters. This is just kind of looking at the characters like in a vacuum and thinking about their overall power level and all of the strengths that they have and all of the weaknesses that they don't have. So for example, a character like Happy Chaos obviously has a very, very high ceiling in a theoretical sense, where his power level is probably the highest in the entire game. You know, in theory, if you play him perfectly, he's incredibly strong, right? A character like Chip is theoretically very, very strong as well, because if you just play perfectly with him, he has literally everything you need to play a fighting game with, and then some. The only downside he has is, you know, low health, that type of thing. Characters like Jacko and Bridget, who are like set play characters, you know, characters that have a more technical side to them, but if played really well, can be extremely oppressive. So this is the first way of thinking that people usually have, where they just kind of look at the characters in a vacuum. And there's nothing wrong with that, and obviously there's value to that. I think some people do this a little bit too much though, and they just kind of look at the character like, oh, this character's just broken. How are they not the best character in the game? I think there's more things that you have to consider when you're looking at the whole picture. So that's option number one when it comes to schools of thought for this topic. Now, this tier list is going to look considerably different than the other one we just talked about, because this is a tier list where if you are considering tournament environment. Worth noting that I'm not saying this is exactly how this type of tier list would look. I'm just kind of using it as an example of how using different schools of thought can change how a tier list can look ultimately. And this is with the idea of a tournament environment. You're playing 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5, depending on the game. This is what it would look like if you were to consider those types of things. Because in this environment, the things that you're considering change drastically. You're accounting for people to be nervous, you're accounting for human error. Usually the characters that do well in this type of environment, there's kind of like 3 archetypes that come to mind. The first one is a character like Nago, for example. Nago is a character who can just hit you and you die, right? His reward is incredibly high, he's very good at forcing situations. And well, you know, he might have some weaknesses and whatnot. In a 3 out of 5 situation, a character like him gets quite a big buff in that type of situation because of the things that he forces on people and the types of situations and the reward he has attached to them. The second type of character that tends to thrive in this environment is a character like Leo, which is the type of character that can afford to make many mistakes because frankly, at this level of play, when you're playing in, you know, a tournament environment and you're nervous, you're going to make a lot more mistakes, right? So playing characters who are both A, easier to play, so you're less likely to make mistakes, and B, characters who are less punished for making mistakes benefit a lot in tournament environments. Nago kind of has that going on as well because he has higher health, obviously. Even a character like Soul can kind of fall under this, right? Like, Soul is kind of a double-edged sword because he is a simple character, means that his game plan is very simple and effective, right? You can just play a basic fighting game, and that's good enough. On the flip side, though, you don't have, like, any set play you can throw at people. You're not like Zato or Jacko. You don't have any like gimmicks or anything you might be able to throw at people. You're just kind of playing a fighting game, right? It goes both ways. He's still a forgiving character because he's relatively easy and he has good defensive options and a decent amount of health. The third types of characters can kind of blend in with the other two, but they're characters that can enforce game plans very strongly and don't have to interact with their opponent. These are characters like Zato, characters like Jacko, and characters like Happy Chaos. These characters should technically be rated a little bit lower, like you could argue that they should be at the lower part of this list, because they are more susceptible to making mistakes, right? They have more execution to them, they have more things that you have to think about, they have their own resources they have to manage. But their reward for doing that is that they don't have to interact with their opponent nearly as much, which is very beneficial in a tournament environment specifically. So just between those two types of, or two ways of thinking, you can already see how different a tier list can look if you evaluate things in different manners. You could argue that a 3 out of 5 / tournament tier list is probably what matters the most, because that's what we play for fighting games, right? The whole point is to win tournaments. So a tier list that reflects a 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5 environment kind of makes the most sense and should probably be what we value more than just theoretically the best characters, right? Because if a character is the best on paper, but they suffer in a 3 out of 5 environment, then maybe they're not actually the best character. Also, before I start talking about this tier, something I forgot to mention about the 3 out of 5 tier list as well, is that characters that have instabilities in their game plan technically go a little bit lower. So a character like Gold Lewis, for example, who I think does get a considerable tournament buff because of how his offense works. He technically has instabilities in his game plan. Even a character like Viken has the same problem where they kind of have to bank on certain things, which is obviously not necessarily ideal for tournament play. So they get a little bit of a knockdown compared to what you may think they should have. IMO. Anyways, so this next tier that we're looking at now is the matchup tier list. This is if you were to try to use matchups to dictate how a tier list should look and how you consider character strength. So if you look at this, there's a lot of characters up here that just have very, very solid matchup spreads. And they don't really consider how matches actually go, like, in practice. They don't really worry about things like, you know, tournament nerves. They don't worry about 3 out of 5 setting. They don't worry about any of that type of thing. It's just like, on paper, do all these characters have good matchups? Yes, they do. Okay, put them up high, right? So a character like Ram is a character who, on paper, has a very good matchup spread. In practice, she can be a little bit more volatile because she has lower health, doesn't have good defensive options, that type of thing. That's kind of the idea of this type of tier list and the advantages and disadvantages it has. Obviously, if your character wins a bunch of matchups, it makes sense that that character should be rated highly. There's also the argument that characters that win important matchups should maybe be rated higher, right? If you're a character who beats, I don't know, Mei, Ram, and Bridget, that's very valuable because in regards to this tier list, those characters would be rated very highly. But you can see how this type of tier list isn't necessarily reflective of like theoretical best or even 3 out of 5 best. Characters like Zato would get ranked way lower in this situation because he frankly doesn't win a lot of matchups. But I think Zato is a good example of why you can't just use matchups to dictate a tier list, because at the end of the day, you have to consider so many other things. Zato can just hit you and win the game. That's not a matchup thing. On paper, all of his tools tend to lose to most of the characters up here, but he can just hit you and win, right? So at the end of the day, between these different types of ways of looking at tier lists, I don't think there's any one correct way of making a tier list. And I think there's value at thinking about all of the different ways of looking at a tier list, if that makes sense. And like I said at the start of the video, I think usually a combination of these ways of thinking is probably best when it comes to making a tier list. There's other things that impact a tier list too, like there's the who is winning tier list, which is just like what character is winning all the tournaments, what character is beating up the person that made the tier list. I think that type of thing technically does matter. You know, if someone's winning a lot with a character, it must mean something, but there's obviously a lot more biasness and like kind of looking towards just results to confirm theory rather than looking at things in an objective sense if you're doing it that way. Either way, I think it's an interesting topic, and I think there's a lot of things you can consider when it comes to making a tier list or talking about character strength in general. I might do another video talking about how to specifically analyze a character and their strengths and weaknesses and the things that you can look out for. At the end of the day, I just think that keeping yourself open-minded about like all the different ways of thinking about a tier list and character strength can be very valuable when it comes to trying to figure things out and understanding why someone may place a character in a certain spot on their tier list. Because very often someone will see a character on a tier list and be like, oh, I don't agree with that character being where they are. The thing about tier lists is that tier lists are supposed to be a thought exercise. They're supposed to be thought-provoking, and they're supposed to get you to consider different ways of thinking and why a character might be more valuable under a certain lens compared to another. Many people just look at tier lists as like, oh, this is, just how it is. This is like this person's, putting their what they think is just correct out there. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can use a tier list as a way to get knowledge and get different understanding, the different viewpoints on the game.